I will. So, right in 1494, Pope Alexander VI, who's also aka Rodrigo Borgia, he fortified the Passetto. And it was a very, very good thing that he did that, because almost immediately after, he was going to become the first pope who would have to use it for real. If you want to go to the next slide with the pictures, I've got a picture of the people we're going to be talking about. So we have Rodrigo Borgia sitting on the left here, and at the beginning of his papacy, Alexander VI had maintained an alliance with the King of France, pictured here on the right, Charles VIII, particularly in supporting Charles's claims on Naples, which was currently under the control of King Ferdinand I. Then, in early 1494, Ferdinand had died and was succeeded by his son, Alfonso II. And of course, King Charles seizes this moment of shifting power and therefore unstable power to make his move. So he and his 25,000-man army invade Italy, intent on marching all the way down to Naples and banking on the Pope's authorization to pass through Rome in the process. And initially, Pope Alexander did support this move and confirmed it under the guise of, oh, I'm supporting Charles on a crusade against the Ottomans, not going down to Naples to obviously take it over. But as Charles started to get deeper into Italy, passing without resistance through city after city, making some token shows of force and reaping the benefits of the French supporting nobles, this really starts to freak Pope Alexander out. Right? He's getting very nervous. This massive army headed straight for Rome is now a very real prospect, and not all of Charles's allies in Rome are allies of the Pope. So if he's already reaping all these benefits of the French supporting nobles, if they get to Rome and they start, making any moves against the Pope, he's screwed. He also began to consider the incredible power and influence that Charles would have if he succeeded in Naples, because he'd be bookending Italy between his two territories. And this makes Alexander panic. And instead of shoring up his alliance with Charles, he turns around and recognizes Alfonso as the rightful and legitimate king of Naples, seeking an alliance with him and retracting all of his support of Charles's claims. And of course, this goes about as well as you would think. French supporting nobles in Italy immediately made moves against the Pope, taking cities where they had the most influence in the name of the French. And Charles kept coming. He was already en route, and he was already authorized to enter the city. And now he has a bone to pick with Pope Alexander. And the Pope is now freaking out, and he appeals to his other allies and even reaches out to the Ottomans, hoping that they will support him against the fury he knows Charles is now going to rain down upon him, and he receives no help at all. Now, on December 31st, 1494, Charles enters Rome with very little resistance. The forces in place to protect the city were vastly outnumbered and didn't resist because Charles was already irate and they did not want to take his punishment. Charles is in charge. He demanded that the Pope turn over land, hostages, and envoys, and when the Pope refused, Charles allegedly threatened, "My barons will acquaint the Pope with my will." So, a statement like that left no illusions in Pope Alexander's mind about diplomacy or getting out of this mess he's made. It's going to be violent coercion, and he knows it. And that's if he gets lucky, because Charles could absolutely depose him on charges of simony. So he has to get out. So on that same night, he made for the Passetto. He took his son, Cesare Borgia, and 4 other cardinals with him, and safely made it to Castel San Angelo, where he locked himself inside. This allowed him to come to terms with Charles at a distance where the threat of force was significantly reduced. Not to mention, the city of Rome grew turbulent rather quickly, and Charles didn't want to stick around and exhaust his army on calming that rabble when he had a kingdom to go win. So he had to make some concessions, and Charles left Rome for Naples. And at that point, by the way, Alfonso II had abdicated and fled, so Charles was crowned King of Naples pretty handily, but only temporarily. Only for a little bit. And as soon as Charles was out of such dangerous proximity, Pope Alexander formed the Holy League with the Holy Roman Emperor and Venice and Milan and Ferdinand of Spain to force Charles back out of Italy. So, job done there. Now, I think it's the next slide, if you want to click over. Perfect. Okay, so the most famous use of the Passetto of all time occurred during the sack of Rome in 1527. And this is where, in every way, the Pope's secret escape route was absolutely 100% the difference between life or death. So, first, let's contextualize this very famous, very brutal invasion of Rome. In the early 16th century, Spain was a massive rising power under the new Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, the Habsburg. And Charles is so in charge here. Because aside from being the emperor, he was also the King of Spain, the Archduke of Austria, and Lord of the Netherlands. So his territory is massive, he has an extensive army, and this army is fortified with various mercenary contingents, so he is the most in charge. He then conquered the territory of King Francis of France, including holding Francis himself for ransom in the Italian Wars. So this means that Charles, who has everything, now also has a fairly secure foothold to broach Italy and the Papal States. So Pope Clement VII, also known as Giulio de' Medici, along with the leaders of Florence, Venice, Milan, and the French king, all decide to ally against Charles in a pact called the League of Cognac. And this deeply offends Emperor Charles, who up until this point had been in a very close alliance with Pope Clement and even supported his election during a very contentious conclave. And by the way, the French king that the Pope is now allying with was on the opposite side of that conclave and didn't want him to be Pope in the first place. Interesting choices. These popes are not necessarily picking their allies here. So the Pope now joining a league with the French king, who was against him first, against Charles, who was with him, is perceived as a huge political betrayal. And this results in the perfect storm of events. Charles was furious with the Pope for breaking their long-standing alliance and was determined to retaliate by having the Pope deposed. He also happened to have an army of 35,000 soldiers and mercenaries who, after the Battle of Pavia, were looking a little mutinous and looking to be paid, which was not something that Charles could do in the moment. So, given that the majority of the mercenaries in his army were Landsknecht Germans with Lutheran/Protestant sympathies, and they were really big on killing churchmen and the idea of destroying the Holy See, Charles decides to kill two birds with one stone. He marches his army to Rome, declares the city as spoils of war, and turned loose his soldiers to gorge themselves on treasure and blood. Can you click the next slide, Steve? Perfect. So the result was devastating. All Pope Clement had at this time to protect the city of Rome was a militia of about 5,000 men and 189 Swiss guards. That's all he has against 35,000 frenzied soldiers with absolutely no limits. So, no. No, it's not going to go well. So homes and churches are looted and destroyed. Monks and priests are killed indiscriminately. nuns were violated, violence was everywhere. People were thrown into the Tiber or out of windows, including children. The nobility were held hostage for obscene ransoms on their lives or the maintenance of their body parts. Mm. Uh, Various eyewitnesses, like Francesco Guicciardini and Jacopo Buonaparte, tell us of streets full of extracted eyes, severed noses, and testicles. In this battle, they loved testicles. Streets full of testicles. Yeah. And all of this is getting started while the Pope was conducting Mass at St. Peter's. He had no idea that this was happening. And it quickly becomes very, very clear to Pope Clement that if mercenaries get their hands on him, he's not going to be taken hostage for ransom. He is going to be murdered, strung up, and disemboweled in the streets. Worse still, St. Peter's is a sitting duck. It cannot be defended. But leaving was just as dangerous. The streets are already overrun with violence and testicles. So, the only so many testicles. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So the only option for Pope Clement to get out alive is the Passetto. And even then, the mobs have to be held off long enough for the Pope to get there and get far enough down the Passetto in order to make it to the Castel in time before they're completely overwhelmed. And this leads to the famous last stand of the Swiss guards. Because remember, all the Pope has to defend himself is 189 Swiss guards. So 42 guards were sent along with the Pope down the Passetto to guard him. And remember, the Passetto is open, so the Pope was seen as he's making his escape, and he was fired on. And if you go to the Passetto today, you can still see the hook marks on the wall where they were trying to get him. Nope, nope, it's there. It's history. It's beautiful. So the other 147 guards stayed at St. Peter's to hold the mob back long enough for the Pope to get to the Castel. And those ones were slaughtered to an absolute man. Even the guard captain, who had been severely wounded and carried to his house nearby, was tracked down and cut to pieces in front of his wife. They were leaving no stone unturned. They were quite literally torn apart. But they held the mobs off long enough for the Pope to be safely secured in the Castel San Angelo. Over 1,000 people were killed in the Vatican area that day, and St. Peter's Basilica was plundered and destroyed. The population of Rome went from 55,000 people down to about 10,000 because the rest were either killed or had fled. But the Pope had not been taken and had not been killed. This is not to say that it was over. The Pope was effectively a prisoner in the Castel, and the raiding continued until huge ransoms were paid, including the Pope basically paid a ransom for himself. But getting to the Passetto kept him alive and defended long enough to eventually be smuggled out of the city. So, again, job done. So this brings us kind of to the end of where we are in our talking points. Fry's going to wrap us up with a quick couple facts before we do questions. Back and forth. So yeah, that concludes our talking presentation. We actually completed on time, so we have time for questions. I see two questions in the chat. So the first one is from Margaret Harden, who says, when were the papal armies created and did they start as a defensive force? The answer to that is essentially at this point, the Papal States were established roughly around the time of Charlemagne in the 8th and 9th century. So an army was naturally required because the Pope starts becoming a secular ruler with secular lands to defend. So they are a defensive force. The Swiss Guards are an entirely other organization, specifically to be the bodyguards of the Pope. That comes a little bit later in about the 16th century, based on hiring mercenaries for something just like this. I love that we've started a debate about food in the chat here. Okay, make sure I didn't miss any. Margaret asks, it's strange to think of the whole order of Europe is about to be flipped over by the Age of Discovery. How disruptive was the New World to 16th century popes? That's a whole episode. I mean, that's a huge topic. They're very, very, very involved with how the New World plays out with the Treaty of Tordesillas, with the whole scale agreement to allow people to be slaughtered and enslaved in the name of missionizing. So much there. It's disruptive, and yet will also benefit them tremendously. It just changes everything, I think. We have like 1 minute left if we have a final question, because we're going to end on time so that everybody can get in here and do what they need to do. But while we're waiting to see if there's another question, thanks everybody for coming. We got a thanks from Dad Pod. Thanks, Dad Pod. All right, I think we're gonna call it there then, so then the next presenters can get in. If you want to continue this conversation, I'm actually going to be moderating another panel, but maybe Steve, if you want to jump into the meeting room. All right, thanks guys. Bye.